Back in 2020, the Like a Dragon franchise officially found a new protagonist in the form of Ichiban Kasuga, the eternal optimist who was dead set on reuniting with his boss and father figure after a long stint in prison. But an even bigger change that came along with this passing of the torch was the gameplay. What started off as an April Fool's joke the year prior ended up being reality. Like a Dragon 7 released as a turn-based RPG. It was a beat-em-up, no more. It was thematically fitting too, as Ichiban is an enthusiastic fan of the Dragon Quest series, as he states within the game itself. But of course, like with every genre switch that occurs with any long-running franchise, the change wasn't met with universal acceptance. It goes without saying that plenty of fans decried the so-called death of the series they loved and refused to play it. But as a fan of RPGs myself, I remained undeterred. In fact, my interest rose. I was more than willing to see how RGG Studio would make such a massive transition from real-time brawling. If they could actually pull off this huge genre shift, they would prove to the world that they're the most well-oiled machine in the business. And pull it off they did. I reviewed the game when it released, and it ended up being one of my top games of 2020. The combat wasn't perfect, and I could still feel that it was a product of a team's first real attempt at turn-based gameplay, but overall, it was a surprisingly competent try. I knew that with a tiny bit of tweaks and mechanical expansions, it could be something really, really cool. Even beyond the dramatic gameplay shift, Like a Dragon 7's story was gripping and emotional, and delivered the heaviest ending in the entire series thus far, at least until the release of Like a Dragon Gaiden, which I'll get to in a minute. Ichiban proved himself to be a worthwhile successor to Kiryu's position as the face of the franchise. He has a drastically different personality, but he carries with him an unshakable sense of duty and a concrete loyalty to his friends and family that only the protag of an RPG would have. And the experience still doesn't stop there. The game continued to carry the legacy of being stuffed with an incredible amount of side content and minigames, including kart racing and business management, and many other worthwhile distractions on top of the usual stuff, like gambling. Overall, Like a Dragon 7 represented a huge shift in the franchise that could have gone sideways, but miraculously didn't. After its release, we were eventually given 2 spin-offs to whet our appetite during the wait for its sequel. Lost Judgment, marking the return of private detective Takayuki Yagami, and a remake of Like a Dragon Ishin, which takes place during the end of the Edo period. The first mainline series content we received since 7's release was Like a Dragon Gaiden, a smaller, more focused entry that featured one last outing with the main face of the series, Kazuma Kiryu. It was originally planned as DLC for Like a Dragon 7, but was expanded to be a standalone title offered for just below full price. I didn't review it, but I found it to be an overall worthwhile experience in Kiryu's saga, an important one to witness if you plan on playing Infinite Wealth, as it features an ending that leaves all others in the dust regarding emotional impact and lead-up. Speaking of Infinite Wealth, however, it was pretty unusual for a new mainline entry to take so long to release, but we soon found out why. As more and more previews came out, it became more and more obvious that this was going to be RGG Studios' biggest, most ambitious, most content-loaded game to date, featuring both Kiryu and Ichiban as main characters with their own narratives and goals, and a gigantic new map of Hawaii. Even as someone who enjoys RPGs and has spent up to 70 hours on a single playthrough of a Like a Dragon game, Infinite Wealth was almost intimidating. It seemed like the type of game that demanded a minimum of 100 hours of investment, but not necessarily in a bad way. I know some people like to complain about long games, but I'm a firm believer that a game can be as long as it wants, but only if it stays good the entire time. Can Infinite Wealth accomplish that? Well, the game is out now, and I bought it, played it, and completed it. And now it's time to talk about it. So let's finally dispense with the preamble and dive into the review. Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth takes place a couple years following the end of Like a Dragon 7, and sees Ichiban Kasuga, our new face of the franchise, enjoying his life in Isazaki Ijincho, where he's now employed at Hello Work, finding ways to give legitimate, clean jobs to former yakuza, even if it means bending the rules a bit. He still regularly meets up with his partners in crime from the last game, Adachi, Nanba, and Saiko, and things seem generally optimistic for everyone. Unfortunately, as anyone might expect, it doesn't stay sunny and carefree forever. After fumbling a first date with Saiko, Ichiban's new life is upheaved when a mysterious and devious VTuber with an immense following creates an expose on him based on total lies, causing Ichiban, Adachi, and Nanba to lose their jobs. Now back at rock bottom, they have to find new ways to make ends meet, but remain unsuccessful due to their tarnished reputations. Soon, a former member of the Arakawa family meets with Ichiban to give him a very important and personal mission that involves going to Hawaii, of all places. Once there, he runs into none other than the legendary Dragon of Dojima, Kazuma Kiryu, and it turns out their goals align. They decide to join forces once again to complete their respective missions, but as with any Like a Dragon game, things end up being much more complicated than expected. I left out a few key details in that plot summary, but that's because the game and its marketing team seem keen on keeping certain elements a surprise for players, even if they are early details that simply get the narrative going. But believe me when I say there's a lot of interesting things to uncover. As you might expect, with a new Like a Dragon game comes a host of new faces. Most notably, there's new party members, Tomizawa and Chitose, who bring their own kind of charm to the game as a regular, tired guy who gets caught up in Ichiban's shenanigans, and a young woman who seems a little too eager to participate, respectively. One major aspect regarding your teammates that's been brought back from the last game is drink links, which are short but big character-building interactions that offer more background, motivation, and personality to your companions. All of them, including the ones you already met in Like a Dragon 7. If you love this series for how its characters are written, then drink links are crucial to do. Not only that, but there are a ton of walk and talk segments scattered around Hawaii, where you initiate a conversation between two or more members of the team. If you play Bandai Namco's Tales of series, then you can basically think of them as skits. These also improve your relationship with your companions and contribute to unlocking more drink links. But, again, I can't really go into more detail about your pals or other characters I want to touch on without at least approaching some level of spoiler territory, so I'll be leaving the finer details to my spoiler comments at the end of the video so the review itself remains spoiler-free. What I can talk about, however, is the new main character that is the bright and sunny Hawaii setting. It's no surprise in the slightest that Ryuga Gotoku Studio went above and beyond to give this new location just as much detail as they gave Isazaki Ijincho. In fact, they're approximately the same size, meaning the explorable land area of Hawaii is about 3 times larger than Kamurocho. I haven't crunched the numbers or anything, this is just my estimate. With both Hawaii and Isazaki Ijincho being in this one game, on top of Kamurocho still being accessible, it means Infinite Wealth has the largest combined map size in the whole franchise, and by a pretty damn good margin. And the game doesn't waste that either. Hawaii is loaded with so much to do and see, I would be shocked if the studio didn't come up with an excuse to go back to it again in another sequel or spin-off. I wouldn't be shocked if a third Judgment game took place here, because otherwise it would feel like a waste of the obvious effort they put into this map. Just as they did with all the Japanese locations, RGG Studio recreated key areas of Honolulu so precisely that I've already seen people find their own apartment buildings and surrounding stores and hangout spots in the game. And of course, the real stars of the shows are the minigames. but we're not going to get into that just yet. I'll get back to those in a bit. I played the PS5 version of the game, and visually, Infinite Wealth shows that even though the game is still a cross-gen title and Dragon Engine is still technically PS4 era technology, it's still a very capable piece of software, offering some really beautiful, dense scenery and jaw-dropping close-ups of characters' faces in key moments. The game handles a remarkable amount of on-screen assets at a single time, because not only is Hawaii huge, it's also no less crowded than Kamurocho or Sotenbori, with an almost excessive amount of physics for every interactable object. And during important cutscenes, the lighting of the room and detail on the cast can be really incredible. Some moments boast such a level of fidelity, it's almost hard to believe it's happening in real time. I was almost convinced that some cutscenes had to be original or lossless quality CG videos, but the file size of the game is a shockingly reasonable 50 gigabytes, so they couldn't have been, because high-quality 4K video is a massive space hog. One observation to speak of regarding the game's performance is the lack of graphical options. We do live in an era where more and more console games offer the choice between playing with a focus on resolution or on frame rate. Almost any and all AA and AAA games offer these options, but Infinite Wealth doesn't bother with it, and honestly, I don't really mind the fact. The game runs at an unlocked 60 frames per second and does a decent job of staying within the ballpark of that upper limit. Drops do exist, especially in specific areas or when battles get super crazy, but I've never encountered a drop so bad that it had me concerned. So all in all, the game looks great and runs quite well. And then we have the music. I've always found the music of this series to be under-discussed, because it's a heavy contributor to the mood of a lot of scenes and fights, and Infinite Wealth is no different. There are some heavy, badass tracks in this score that further elevate some of the coolest encounters. There's a heavy use of drum and bass in the soundtrack, but you'll also get the occasional orchestral sound merged with it to offer some really cool progression and texture to a piece. And of course, there's also returning compositions with new arrangements, so longtime fans will recognize some of the tunes featured in the game, and, in all likelihood, be blown away about when they pop up. Speaking of audio, there is something else I want to touch on, and that's voice acting. Now let me start off by saying that I played Infinite Wealth with the Japanese dub, as I always do. I've casually peeked over at other streamers and channels who played with the English dub, and from what little I've heard, the cast does seem pretty solid overall. But one observation I made while playing the Japanese dub is the fact that some characters are supposed to be Hawaii natives, meaning they're native or at least fluent in English, and boy does that not come across in the Japanese dub. Now don't get me wrong, I respect the Japanese cast for trying their hardest at speaking a language they're not proficient in. They likely know more about English than I know Japanese. But in some cases, I had to really lean in and point my ears at the TV to understand one or two characters who apparently lived in Hawaii their entire life. This is not any sort of significant criticism. I'm not saying I would strike points off for it if I did give point scores. It's just an observation I made that some of you might want to know for some reason or another. Now, let's finally get to the real meat of any Like a Dragon experience, the gameplay and content. We'll begin by going over what is probably still the elephant in the room for some people, and that is the combat. One of the most impressive things about Like a Dragon 7 was the sheer fact that the turn-based combat was so pleasantly competent despite it being RGG Studios' first attempt at such a system. I was surprised at how serviceable it felt, but it still had a ways to go before it was ideal, before it felt like the perfect version of itself. So imagine my shock when I start to hit my stride in Infinite Wealth's combat a few hours in, and I realize they've already done it. With just one more attempt, RGG Studio has practically perfected the formula they were going for, and they did it in a few key ways. First is movement. Every time a party member's turn comes up, you're finally able to reposition them within a small circle to set up a good line of attack. The lack of this ability was a problem in the last game because both your team and enemies would casually walk around and you could do absolutely nothing to stop or redirect it. And it ruined a lot of upcoming turns. It was an element of randomness that didn't really need to be there. Infinite Wealth finally addresses this with a small change, but its impact is huge. It gives more consistency and reliability to fights, and you don't have to be paranoid about strategies or plans failing because a team member walked 3 steps in one direction you didn't want them to before you gained control of them. Furthermore, it could also be a good decision defensively to spread your team out so enemy area of effect attacks are less likely to hit everybody. The second big contributor for better combat is attack bonuses. Thanks to repositioning being a thing now, it's also possible to maximize damage output with just your normal attacks thanks to multiple types of damage bonuses. First, there's back attacks, which dramatically increase damage when you're able to put yourself directly behind your target. It's not possible to do when that target is also targeting you, however, because it means they'll always face you, so you gotta take it when you can get it. And then there's proximity bonuses, where an extra strike or 2 is added to your party member's attack because the enemy is within their ideal range. And of course, you can combine both a back attack and proximity bonus for a gigantic damage boost that, more often than not, leads to a one-shot kill on normal mobs, or at least very close to one. No more relying exclusively on skills for big damage. Normal attacks are now not only totally feasible for that, but they might even be preferred if you can get both damage bonuses at the same time. The game also removes one of the most annoying mechanics in the last game: free hits. Whenever a party member attacked an enemy that was far away and would run to them, but there was another enemy on the way over, that enemy would get a free hit on your character. Now granted, your party members could do the same to enemies, but your party is only 4 members in size, and this would get really annoying when fighting a team of 5 enemies or more, especially when they were huddled somewhat close to each other and avoiding non-targets was difficult. Infinite Wealth made the correct decision in just throwing this entire mechanic out the window. It was stupid and unnecessary, and they realized it. So no more free hits for anyone, just repositioning and attack bonuses. The third and last big contributor to combat improvement is the focus on areas of effect. A huge portion of special attacks and skills have areas of effect that offer even more incentive to take advantage of the new repositioning mechanic. Some specials are normal and have only one selectable target, but it's still possible to swipe a second enemy or even just knock your target into them for a bit of extra damage, just like with normal attacks. But some specials have radial areas that hit everything around them. Some of them have cones, some of them have thin or wide straight lines. Some of them are even random. The greater emphasis on space, position, and direction dramatically improves the game by leaps and bounds. Combat is so improved over Like a Dragon 7, I'm actually surprised it only took one more game to reach this point. I dare say the combat might be almost perfect for what RGG Studio is going for now. I can't think of any other mechanics that truly bothered me except maybe the continued wandering around of enemies in the battle area, occasionally making setups difficult, but that may be on purpose in order to encourage quick decision making. But it is still possible to kind of push them around if they're inside your area of movement. Now let's go over combat adjacent aspects of the gameplay, and for the most part, that's the job system. The job system was already present in Like a Dragon 7, and gave a lot of room regarding team composition. Every job had its strengths and weaknesses. For example, one job would have high defense but low attack, and another would lack a set of ranged skills but have a selection of strong melee ones. Or one job would have few attack skills but high utility and buffing options, so on and so forth. With a grand total of 20 jobs, Like a Dragon 7 had tons of ways to mix and match. Much like the combat itself, the job system in that game was also very competent for a first-time attempt. But I'm glad to say, Infinite Wealth also expands the job system where it counts. Not only are there more jobs in total, but now there's finally a skill inheritance system. As you play through the game and interact with your party members, you'll increase your bond with them, as I mentioned earlier. And every 10 levels you increase your bond, you unlock an extra slot for skill inheritance. Skill inheritance is exactly what it sounds like. If you play a certain job and level it up enough to have a decent list of skills for it, you can switch to another job and select up to 6 skills from any prior job to equip to your new one. So not only is there a deeper team composition in Infinite Wealth, there's builds you can craft for each individual character as well. You can pick a job to settle a character into that has a certain set of strengths, but then bolster that job further with suitable skills from other jobs, or to cover that job's weaknesses. It's all up to you. Next is side content, and there's a fucking ton to touch on here. But we're going to start off with Substories, a franchise staple. I won't go into too much detail because, much like the actual central plot of the game, there are surprises in store for Substories, especially when you're playing as Kiryu, who has a very special set of them dedicated to reminiscing about his past adventures. It's Ichiban who has the regular, fun, lighthearted side missions the series is known for, and they're more detailed than ever. For a long time during the early parts of the franchise's history, Substories were usually quick and simple tasks, but they gradually became bigger, longer, and required multiple steps. Infinite Wealth feels like the end result of this trend, because Ichiban's Substories are fairly lengthy, multi-part adventures of their own, as far as Substories go. I'd wager they were made like this partly to get players to explore the Hawaii map more, and if that's the case, they succeeded. Substories cover a huge variety of objectives, characters, themes, morals, and jokes, and some of them even have small, contained minigames of their own. They're rewarding in both the sense that they're just very entertaining, and the fact that you literally do get pretty good rewards. In fact, some of them come in the form of pound mates, which are summons you call into battle. This is another combat mechanic that saw some tweaking, because now some summons actually stick around and attack or heal for multiple turns. It's really cool. Now let's get into minigames, another staple of the Like a Dragon experience. This is where Ryuga Gotoku Studios' approach to side content shines, arguably more so than the Substories. Ever since Like a Dragon 5, where minigames included street racing, hunting, and a variety of rhythm games, the franchise's minigame repertoire has only been getting more impressive, and Infinite Wealth is the pinnacle thus far. There's 2 huge minigames here that I honestly struggle to even call mini, but I'll get back to those in a bit, because there's smaller minigames to touch on first. The usual suspects are back, such as karaoke, batting cages, darts, and whatnot, so I won't go over them. I'll only touch on stuff new to Infinite Wealth. First is Crazy Delivery, which is basically Uber Eats meets Crazy Taxi. It also feels a bit like the can collecting minigame in 7, which also makes a return by the way. Basically, Ichiban bikes around the eastern half of the Hawaii map collecting foods to deliver to customers, and he can do flips and spins for more points. It's an early minigame, so don't expect to depend on it for a lot of actual money to spend out in the world, but it's a solid distraction that has some worthwhile rewards. Next is Mismatch, an online dating minigame where Ichiban has to create a profile which you can customize yourself, and there's some pretty funny presets, and then try to rizz up matches so he can meet them offline. But the real question is, who is real and who is a catfish. This minigame is pretty fun and requires some quick thinking, but it offers no rewards for participation, so it's strictly a distraction to do for fun. And then there's arcades. Yes, arcades are also a commonly returning minigame staple, but the games specifically featured here are pretty interesting. We have Virtua Fighter 3 TB, probably my least favorite game in the series if I'm being honest, but we also have Sega Bass Fishing and motherfucking Spike Out, a beat-em-up game created by Toshihiro Nagoshi earlier on in his career, which only had ever been released in arcades. And the last new minigame to touch on isn't really a minigame, it's a dungeon. In both Hawaii and Isazaki Ijincho, there is a dungeon specifically meant to be a place for grinding and leveling up. It's divided into floors, and every floor has procedurally generated tiles, so they're never the same layout every time you do them. There's also people to rescue in these dungeons for extra rewards, and every 5 floors there is a boss fight, which turns into a checkpoint so you don't have to start from the beginning. The dungeons also have their own collectible currency system to spend on weapons, resources, etc. So it's not truly a minigame, but it is a worthwhile way to spend some time if you want to grind levels or ranks for other jobs to quickly get new skills. So with an extremely solid lineup of smaller minigames established, what are those bigger minigames I mentioned earlier? Well, they are massive time sinks, and they have enough associated content that if you ripped both of them out of Infinite Wealth and bundled them together in their own $20 standalone digital game, it'd be a perfectly reasonable price to pay. And that's without adding any additional content that's already in Infinite Wealth. Let me explain. First, there's Sujimon, which is a Pokemon parody where you collect enemies. This is technically a returning aspect from Like a Dragon 7, but the difference here is that in 7, you only learned information about enemies, but in Infinite Wealth, you finally catch them, by literally offering them a gift and hoping they accept, and battle them against other Sujimon commanded by trainers. It's no longer a Pokemon parody in name only, it's now a parody mechanically too. Sujimon trainers are scattered around the map of Hawaii, organized by ranks, and it's up to Ichiban to collect a strong team, train them, and dethrone the best trainers in the world, literally called the Discreet Four. Furthermore, there's not just Pokemon systems in here, there's gacha as well. You can get more Sujimon by participating in timed raids all over the place, but if you'd rather test your luck, you can walk up to Sujimon gacha points and spend either money or tickets for pulls. And once you have the Sujimon you want, you can organize a team of 6, keeping in mind their type and what their special attacks are, which cost MP you slowly accumulate during a match. The entire Sujimon minigame is shockingly thorough, and it's honestly pretty funny that Infinite Wealth came out with this minigame immediately following the release of Palworld, which got a ton of shit even though it's closer to a clone of Arc than it is a clone of Pokemon. But either way, it's totally possible to lose a good several hours of time to the Sujimon journey, especially if you're a perfectionist who wants to, well, catch 'em all. And the second, even bigger minigame is Dondoko Island, which is best described as RGG Studio finding a way to cram Animal Crossing into a Like a Dragon game. You might think that's an exaggeration, but let me explain. Ichiban has to wander around a fairly decently big island and start clearing trash by smashing piles of it with his bat. This allows him to collect cloth and plastic resources. You can also smash rocks and trees too for stone and wood. Every day these resources respawn, and the goal is to smash enough trash so that you can pay, with currency called Dondoko bucks, to have the trash permanently removed, so you can start placing crafted buildings in that spot to increase the island's satisfaction and popularity. When you clear out the designated spots and increase those parameters enough, you finally become a 1-star resort. Then you need to clear out more spots and further increase satisfaction and popularity to become a 2-star resort. then 3, then 4, and finally 5. You also need to level up your crafting ability, and you do that by, well, crafting. Everything you make using the resources you collect gives you more resort points, but depending on the type of building you make, you also give potential visitors opportunities to spend money and increase points even more. And believe me when I say there is an insane amount of buildings you can create. And a lot of them seem to be buildings ripped straight out of Kamurocho, and I mean that quite literally. I think these buildings are straight up Kamurocho assets, which means you can turn Dondoko Island into a small city. In addition to gathering crafting resources, you can also fish, catch bugs, create souvenirs to give to visitors to increase their enjoyment, and you can remodel your own house. Yes, Ichiban gets his own house, and the more furniture you fill it with, the more Ichiban's max health increases during this minigame. I think I painted a good enough picture of the general idea, but some of you might be wondering, why does Ichiban need health in this minigame? Does that mean he's fighting something? Well, this is a Like a Dragon game, so of course he's fighting something. And in this case, it's trash pirates, meaning sailors who literally dump trash all over the island. And this brings us to the combat of Dondoko Island, which is neither turn-based or like regular Like a Dragon brawling. To put it bluntly, Dondoko combat feels like the combat of a village management game that focuses on crafting and gathering first, and combat second. Meaning, combat on Dondoko Island actually kinda sucks ass. It's easy and simple, but it's not all that engaging. In fact, the action of swinging Ichiban's bat is sometimes infuriating because Dondoko enables a very aggressive soft lock-on that I ended up fighting against a lot. The soft lock-on often desperately tried to get me to target something I wasn't trying to target, and it oftentimes got me hit by enemies. All that being said, it's far from a deal breaker. You might think that's all that's left to touch on, but it isn't. Once you progress far enough, you unlock Dondoko Farm, which is where your Sujimon come in. This is an impressive aspect of Infinite Wealth's minigame ecosystem, because it does an excellent job at weaving both Sujimon and Dondoko together in a way that makes them both worth doing, even if you intend on focusing on just one. On Dondoko Farm, you can train your Sujimon, have them farm plants or vegetables, or have them gather more building resources. It takes real-life time for them to complete these tasks, but they're very lucrative. There's literally no downside to choosing the most rewarding tasks other than the fact that they take longer. You're not punished for assigning low-level Sujimon. In fact, you're just rewarded more if you assign high-level ones instead. The minigame of Dondoko Island is one hell of a time sink. From gathering resources, to fighting off enemies, to crafting, from fishing to catching bugs, to giving gifts to visitors, and renovating your house, there's a fuck ton of stuff to do. I tried to get through Dondoko Island at a pretty quick pace, and even considering that, I still spent around 12 hours on it, and that was only to get it to a 5-star resort. You can still work on it after the fact, and unlock more visitors and turn the island into a huge money farm, because the game allows you to convert Dondoko bucks to yen or US dollars. Dondoko Island is a very worthwhile activity. Just be warned that once you start, it is a commitment. Regardless though, it is definitely going down in the Like a Dragon minigame Hall of Fame. Now, before I close out this review, I do have to address a bit of an elephant in the room. Sadly, the writing was on the wall for a while regarding strange and downright egregious DLC practices. The franchise had its fair share of horrible DLC offerings before, such as one-time only item packs that are literally one-time only, meaning you use them once for one save file and never again, even if you start a new game. Stuff like that is an honest ripoff, but it's easier to ignore because it's just an item pack. It's not real significant content. Unfortunately, when Like a Dragon 7 released in Japan, it was found out that Japanese players had to purchase New Game Plus separately in order to add it to the game. Us Western fans, however, were lucky. New Game Plus was included in our version when we got it. But some people understood the precedence here, that when the next game got a simultaneous worldwide release, it would charge Western fans for New Game Plus, just as it will for Japanese fans. And that's exactly what happened. New Game Plus for Infinite Wealth costs $20 as part of the Master Vacation Pack, or an extra $15 if you bought the deluxe edition of the game. I'm not going to go over any of the other content or options this pack includes, because I just didn't buy it. That's not to say I'll never buy it. There might come a day where I want to replay the game, but not have to go through the trouble of leveling up jobs again. But as of now, I have no desire for it, because even without New Game Plus, Infinite Wealth is still a very content-heavy game. It's almost insane how much was crammed in here. That being said, a lot of people are rightfully angry and frustrated that a game mode that's always in the base game when a game has it is suddenly ripped out and turned into an extra purchase. This is a picture-perfect example of a greedy publisher removing content to charge more for it. It's something that people have been critical of regarding industry-wide DLC practices for well over a decade now, and Sega's doing it without a hint of subtlety. I can't help but question how many decisions surrounding the game's marketing and release were made by Sega instead of RGG Studio themselves, because this New Game Plus fiasco and their choice of, say, streamers to give an early copy to have been questionable at best. The last thing I want to see is this franchise I've been a diehard fan of for 13 years finally reach the point where it's too popular for its own good, because it opened the door for shadier and scummier nickel and diming by executives who finally see how much money it can make them. Overall, even without the New Game Plus DLC, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth is quite possibly the new peak of the series. It has drastically improved gameplay over its predecessor, and so much content it makes other games in the franchise blush. It's loaded with charm, personality, emotion, entertainment, and general love and appreciation of the fact that it's a video game. The characters are likable, the plot is investing and impactful, the music kicks ass, everything you do is rewarding in some form or another. If I had to give any criticisms, it would be story beats near the end not hitting as hard as I would hope, which I will get to in a bit in my spoiler comments. Otherwise, Infinite Wealth might just be my new favorite entry. One question I've seen people have about Infinite Wealth is it okay to jump into the series with this installment, having played no other Like a Dragon games before? Strictly speaking, no one's holding a gun to your head and saying you can't. But there's a lot of aspects of this game's story where the emotional impact and payoff highly depends on you having played most, if not all, other previous games. I won't give away the ending right here, but there is a heavy implication throughout the entire game and even its own marketing that this could be Kiryu's last outing as a main character, and the story does play into that really hard. So consider this my warning to you. If you play Infinite Wealth as your first Like a Dragon game, you will enjoy it gameplay-wise, but the emotional beats will not hit as hard, and there's a lot of them. If that matters to you, don't jump into the series with Infinite Wealth. Start with 0, which is the safest starting point, and work your way up from there. It is worth it. Even the worst games in this series are still pretty good, which is saying a lot when there's 9 of them. Now with the review done and out of the way, I do have some spoilery comments to make. So if you don't want to hear spoilers, close the video now. And these comments are going to include the very ending of the game. So this is your official warning. You are now entering spoiler territory. Heavy spoiler territory. Alright, it's your fault now. I'll keep this fairly short. This has mostly to do with characters and where they end up, as opposed to the plot itself. I like Chitose overall, but the reveal that she's both a spy and the VTuber Hisoka Tatara kinda gives the impression that she's two characters merged into one. And that's also on top of her being the heiress to a huge corporation. I wouldn't be surprised if early concepts of the story had another female character that RGG Studio just combined with Chitose. There's also Yamai, who was billed as a villain in some of the marketing, and he is an antagonist for the first act of the story, but he slowly turns around and becomes more and more likable. I get the feeling he's being built up to possibly be Ichiban's Majima, so to speak. I don't know if RGG Studio will commit to that idea, but I am willing to bet they are keeping it on the table as an option if they want to. I don't need to explain to any seasoned Like a Dragon fans how much they love bringing characters back. And then there's Bryce, one of the actual main antagonists of the story, and man, he just wasn't all that interesting in the grand scheme of things. He's just an old man leading a cult that had nothing to do with anything until a third of the way into the game. Ebina is more investing though, but I can't guess why RGG Studio made Ebina Kiryu's final boss. They say he's Ichiban's half-brother, but Ichiban himself is told this, and they go nowhere with the information. It's a little perplexing. And then there's the Daidoji, the shadowy faction that controls Kiryu's life. Honestly, they're just starting to annoy me. They were intriguing in Gaiden, but in Infinite Wealth, they're really overstaying their welcome. I hope Like a Dragon 9 either gets rid of them or just turns them into the antagonists. Those are the only directions I care about them going in. And then we have Eiji, who quite possibly has the lamest backstory and motivations for his villainy, considering how hard he swings in his morals. He loses his job as a journalist, and that's apparently enough for him to resort to kidnapping and being an accessory to potential child murder, which he is completely aware of. I'm not really feeling that, and on top of that, he is directly responsible for the deaths of Hanawa and Wang To. And finally, we have the total lack of a resolution for Kiryu at the end. He's at the hospital, looking sickly as all hell, and he still does not get a reunion with Haruka, which is instead teased for a later date. I understand RGG Studio is hesitant to tie this up, but they need to commit soon because too much teasing will eventually turn anticipation into annoyance. That's pretty much everything I have to say spoiler-wise. So while I love the game overall, its story resolutions leave some things to be desired. This concludes my review of Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.